So we're going to start in Matthew today. So we're going to be in Matthew 26 to start off with. So last week we heard Jesus' final lessons to his disciples, and we saw his prayer for them and for us. Okay, so remember they were leaving their dinner and they were heading down to the garden. Okay, we also saw that he had some warnings about denial and abandonment that these guys were going to be doing in just a matter of moments as they were leaving the Passover meal, and they really didn't believe him. They didn't understand what he was saying. They didn't understand that they would abandon him in that moment. They were completely committed to him, and they didn't understand what was going on. Okay, so we're going to pick up in the story. So they have now passed through the city down into the Kidron Valley, and they're heading to the garden. Okay, so we're going to pick up in Matthew 26 and verse 36. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Okay, so he's taken them to this garden, and now we have 11 disciples. We're down to 11. Judas is not here. He's coming, but he's not here yet. So he takes the 11, and he brings them to a place in the garden, which I love this about Jesus, that he didn't take them to the temple. He didn't even leave them in a house. He took them out to a beautiful garden, and he goes, "Sit here and pray. I need you to pray for me. I need you to pray for yourselves. I just need you to pray." And then he takes Peter and John and James, the two sons of Zebedee, and he takes them a little further. And he says, "All right, guys, I need y'all to pray. Please pray for me." And then he goes a little further by himself and deeper into the garden, and he prays. Okay? So in this garden, there would be these massive ancient oak trees, and they're just absolutely gorgeous. And Gethsemane means olive press. And so back then, they didn't just plant olive trees because they were beautiful. They planted them for the olives. So they would have a press there, and when the olives were ripe, they would take the olives off the tree, put it in the press, and crush it. That's how you get olive oil. You have to press the oils. This is where Jesus decides to come and pray in his very last hours before he is getting ready to be crushed and poured out. He is, again, as the beautiful teacher, giving them an example all around of what is getting ready to happen to him, so that they will recall it later and understand what he was trying to tell them. Well, he cries out to the Father, and we see the closest moments of Jesus and the Father. Jesus does not want to endure the pain he is getting ready to suffer, but he understands this is part of the plan. I understand the concept of your plan, but I'm going to be the one that's going to have to walk through it. I'm going to be the one that has to endure it. Okay? So he is completely pressed by the weight of what is coming his way, just like the olives. And then the cup that Jesus is talking about here, most people assume that he's talking about the dead part of this. But actually, it's a cup of judgment, of God's wrath. And it's talked about a lot in the Old Testament, and specifically, he's probably bringing to mind Jeremiah 25:15, which says, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me, take from my hand this cup of the wine of wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it." Okay? So it's a cup of judgment, a cup of wrath that Jesus is taking for us, for the nations. Okay? But this prayer that Jesus is praying isn't a prayer of lack of faith. It's actually one of the most faithful prayers that you can pray. I understand and acknowledge what your will is. Okay? I am putting my hope and my faith and my trust in your plan. That's the biggest prayer of faith that you could ever pray to God. It's if there is another way, but if there's not, I'm okay with whatever you're going to do. That is a huge prayer of faith that Jesus is displaying for us. That even when we're getting ready to go through stuff and we see it coming, to say, okay, if you aren't going to change the plan, then change me in the plan. Okay? That is a huge prayer of faith that he is demonstrating for us. So that's exactly what God does. Instead of removing the cup, he strengthens his son, even to the point of bringing an angel there with him to strengthen him. Well, it's been a very long week. It's been a very long day. It's been a very long night. And the disciples have their bellies full of wine and food. They have been up now for over 24 hours. And they, like we would, fall asleep. They don't understand what Jesus is talking about. They don't know Judas is coming. They fall asleep. And 3 times he has to go and wake them up and ask them to pray. Okay? He's begging them, please pray. But not a single person in here has not fallen asleep or gotten distracted while we've been praying. Okay? So we got to give them a little bit of grace. But he begs them, please pray. And Luke, the doctor, makes a point to tell us that Jesus' prayers and stress are so heavy on him that his sweat is mixed with blood. Okay? So this is how much stress our Jesus is under. Well, the time comes. Judas is heading their way, and he's not alone. Let's go to John 18, and we'll see who Judas brings with him. Okay. John 18, verses 3 and 4. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, who do you seek? Okay? So here comes Judas. He's not alone. He has Roman soldiers with him, and he has temple officers with him. Okay? Sent with the authority of the Pharisees. So it's obvious that these religious leaders expected a fight. If you bring that many soldiers and trained people with you, they're expecting Jesus to put up resistance. They're expecting a fight on their hands, okay? And in the other Gospels, we are told that Judas has arranged a sign with them. I'm going to show you which one to arrest. So Judas knows he's selling out only one person. He knows he doesn't want to arrest all the other guys. There's one person who has been paid for. The one that I greet with a kiss. That's your guy. That's who you arrest. So as Judas approaches Jesus, he approaches him with greetings, Rabbi, greetings, teacher, and gives him a customary kiss on the cheek. This was a greeting that you greeted people with, okay? Jesus responds with, friend, do what you've come to do. It's okay, Judas. It's okay. I understand the plan. Do what you've come to do. It's part of the plan. So then Jesus directs all attention to himself, and he asks, who do you seek? And they answer with the simplest identification they can. Jesus of Nazareth. Not Rabbi Jesus, not even Joseph, Jesus ben Joseph, his full and true name. We seek the Jesus from Nazareth. Okay? And he replies with, I am. So not only identifying himself, identifying his deity, but saying, you don't have to worry about these other guys. Don't worry about them. You come for me, I'm going to go willingly with you. Okay? So he is protecting the other 11 guys that are with him while displaying his deity and his majesty and confirming who he is. Okay? By saying that, the soldiers have to take a knee. Now, I don't know if you know anything about Roman soldiers. They're huge guys. Think bodybuilders, massive dudes, okay? Not dudes to cower to anyone. They do not bend the knee except to Caesar, and Caesar alone. And just by Jesus saying the words, I am, and the deity and majesty that are in those 2 words is him saying it, they have to step back and take a knee in front of him. That's how powerful that Jesus is displaying right now. Listen, I could take you guys out with just a word. I don't need a sword. I don't need 10,000 angels. I can take you out with my words, and I'm choosing not to. But I'm showing you my restraint here. Well, in the middle of all of this, Peter gets an idea. Our beloved Peter, who opens up his mouth and sticks his foot in it, he pulls out a sword. Now, don't think sword. Think sword. These were personal weapons that you would carry if you were traveling because you would fall among thieves and you had to defend yourself. So you were not brandishing like, a big old sword. It was more like a dagger, a personal sword that you would keep on yourself. A little tiny weapon, okay? So he takes out his little dagger, and he goes after, not soldier, not soldier, not soldier, not soldier. He goes after a servant of the high priest. And he takes off what we're told is his right ear. And we go, okay, big deal, right? Can I have a volunteer for a second? I promise all you have to do is stand here.
Okay.
I'm not going to lose my ear.
Actually, take that ear off. I have no weapons. This way, just hold it so we get the camera. Okay, so if I'm Peter, and you're the servant, and I've got a weapon, and I go to attack, which ear am I going to hit? Your left one. It says the right one, so guess how I have to attack you? Turn around.
You're sneaky.
Behind.
Peter attacked him from behind to take off his ear. And he went after a servant, not all those soldiers who were standing there. So is Peter really courageous in this moment?
No.
Absolutely not. Thank you. Yeah. So it's very important to pay attention to details. The right ear means he would have had to attack the man from behind. And he went after a servant. Okay? Well, Peter has now caused a mess. Okay? There's not only blood all over the place and an ear on the ground, but now there's a mess because Peter has now assaulted a servant of the high priest. Now Peter can be arrested for assault. So Jesus says, Peter, put away your sword. I don't need you to help me. And now I have a mess of yours to clean up. So Jesus picks up the ear off the ground and puts it back on the man's head, and everything is fine, erasing all evidence of the assault. So now Peter cannot be arrested because there is no evidence of assault. We have eyewitnesses, but the man's ear is completely healed. What assault? Jesus has completely cleaned up Peter's mess here. And he tells Peter, it's not time yet, Peter. Okay? I know you're trying to help, but it's not time yet. Okay? So the guards then arrest Jesus and bind him as if he's the one who pulled the sword, as if he's done nothing but stand there and declare who he is. They bind him and take him away. And at this, the disciples scatter in every direction. They run for their own safety. And Mark, in his gospel, tells us that there was a certain young man there. And at this, and all of the confusion of all of these soldiers grabbing at people and pushing people and everybody scattering and causing an issue, this guy has his tunic pulled off and he runs away naked. Most agree that this is John Mark, and this is his way of saying, I was there, but I don't really want to tell you that I was there. I was noticing what was happening, and I fled so hard in the midst of everything that the sheer tunic that I had on, basically like the equivalent of pajamas, got ripped and torn in the process because I was running away. So that's John Mark's little confession there. I was there too. Okay? So they scatter in every direction, but Jesus is taken to Ananias and Sapphira. Okay? So let's go to John. Stay in John 18 and jump down to verse 13. First they led him to Ananias, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Okay? It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. So John brings this back up again, and there's a reason. So Ananias is the high priest from AD 6 to AD 15. Caiaphas is his son-in-law. Okay? And it was Caiaphas who told them earlier that it would be better if one man died than for all of the nation to come under discipline of Rome. Okay? John is showing us this because this is not going to be a fair trial. They've already decided Jesus is guilty. This is not going to be a fair trial. So don't expect a fair trial. Because everyone reading this letter would go, great, Jesus is going to get on trial, he's going to be found not guilty, and everything's going to be hunky-dory. So he's going, spoiler alert, it's not going to be a fair trial. So don't expect that. So Ananias was actually removed by Rome in AD 15 and replaced with Caiaphas. Okay? Caiaphas then rules as the high priest to about 35, 36, that's when he dies. Okay? But according to the Old Testament, a high priest could not be replaced until their death. So technically, ironically, in the eyes of the Jews, both were high priests. Because that's why we have this confusion. That's why they're kind of both called high priests, depending on which gospel you see. Because it was actually an illegal transfer of power. Okay? So by Rome's standard, one of them's the high priest. And by the Jewish people's standard, the other one is the high priest. So we have this juxtaposition here, this battle for power. Okay? So, he goes to Ananias, and after he goes to Ananias, Jesus is taken before Caiaphas, okay? Who's gathering this group of Sanhedrin. So he's going out in the middle of the night, okay, this is very early in the morning, and getting these people out of their beds to come and pass judgment, and he's bringing them to his house. So it's very likely that the two high priests kind of shared this big compound, where they would have multiple rooms in different parts of it, and he's just being kind of passed back and forth. Well, this nighttime trial is absolutely and utterly illegal on a lot of accounts in the Sanhedrin's own laws and regulations. First of all criminal trials must begin and end in daylight. It has not been daybreak yet. So we're in the middle of the early morning hours, but it's not daybreak yet. All criminal cases cannot be tried during Passover. It is the Friday of Passover. Okay, it's not even Passover week, it is Passover. Because their day starts 6 p.m. the previous night. So it's Passover. This is a criminal trial case. Only releases could happen on the day of conviction. If you were convicted, or the day of your trial. So if you went to trial and you got a not guilty, you could be released the same day. If you got a guilty verdict, you actually had to go spend the night in jail, so that, hoping that mercy would arise in your judges. Okay? So it could not happen on the same day. If you were tried guilty, it had to wait one night. All evidence had to be guaranteed by 2 male witnesses. They had to be separately examined, and they had to completely agree with each other. We do not find that here. We find every single witness that they bring forward has a different testimony. They are arguing with each other in front of the Sanhedrin. They're not being even questioned separately here. Okay? False witnesses were punishable by death. That's not here. We have all these false witnesses that we've had to pay off, and they're not held accountable for their false witnesses. Okay? And all evidence of your innocence had to be presented first, before your guilt, before being what you were being accused of. We find no record of that in any of the Gospels, that any of Jesus' innocence was brought to trial first. Okay? And finally, the decision had to be made in one location only. It was in the temple, and it was called the Chamber of Hewn Stone. It's where the Sanhedrin sat. You could only convict someone in that room. We're in a house.
So normally would that be where your trial would occur also?
Yes. Yep. So it's a semicircle room. You have the high priest that sits up front. You have the 70 to 72 who sit around you, and then scribes sit at the back of the room. And you literally stood right there and had your trial. They would bring witnesses forward, and you could only be convicted in that room. So we're in Ananias' house, and we're in Caiaphas' house. We're not in the temple. Okay? So illegal on multiple fronts according to their own laws. Okay? So even having a difficult time finding witnesses and finding witnesses to agree, they are able to charge Jesus with threatening to destroy the temple. Okay? So they take his prophecy of death and resurrection and they twist it to a terrorist threat. He's threatening to take down our temple. Okay? All the while, Jesus is completely silent. He doesn't have anything to say for himself until he's directly asked by the high priest, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" He says, "You have said a true statement," which would be considered blasphemy if he wasn't who he said he was. He says, "You've said correctly. I am who I say I am." So they charge him then with blasphemy. They spit on Jesus, they beat him, they mock him, and they put him in shackles. Okay? Now, can I tell you this happened whether he was guilty or innocent? They would treat people who were innocent or guilty, both the Jews and the Romans, like this. Because you're now standing trial, it was a hope that even if you were innocent, you were an example to everyone else to stay in line. Okay? Meanwhile, Peter is outside, cleaning his sword. And he's determined to prove Jesus wrong. Jesus told him just a couple of hours ago, "You're going to deny me 3 times. He's already run off, and now he's come back. So he's out in the courtyard, warming himself by a coal fire. It's a little chilly tonight. The sun has not risen. And in verse 25, we read, "Now Simon was standing and warming himself, so they said to him, 'You also, are you not one of his disciples, are you?' And he denied it and said, 'I am not.'" Okay? Peter was not questioned before the council. He was not even questioned before a hostile mob. These were two women, young women, who asked him, "Aren't you one of them? Aren't you one of his followers?" Peter not only denies 3 times, cowardly about his master, his denials grow stronger with each one. So first is a lie, and then he takes an oath, and then he invokes a curse upon himself. That is the strongest language he could deny his Savior with. Okay? And after that third one, day breaks and the rooster crows and everything clicks inside of Peter. And he goes, uh-oh. The prophecies now come true. What Jesus said was going to happen, happened. And he lays eyes on Jesus across the courtyard. And he weeps. Everything gets weighed and crashes down on Peter. The weight of his denial and everything that Jesus said was going to happen happened. And Friday morning dawns. It is now 6 a.m. on Friday morning. So though the decision to condemn Jesus was already made and he had already been brought before both Ananias and Caiaphas, they had to conduct a second trial because it's now daylight. They knew that their first one was illegal. We're going to cover our own butts and we're going to do a second trial. Okay? So Luke 22 verse 66 says, "When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered, both the chief priests and the scribes, and they led him away to their council." So now we're getting everybody involved. Because we only had to have a couple of people from the Sanhedrin, and now we're going to get everybody involved. And we're going to take him to the official meeting place, and everybody's going to be present. That's why they mentioned scribes there, knowing where they are and what has to take place. So they asked Jesus similar questions. He has similar answers. In verse 77, they said, "What further testimony do we need? We've heard it from his own lips. He's claiming to be deity. He's claiming to be the Messiah. What more proof do we need?" And the Sanhedrin know that all they could do was throw him in jail for a while. That's not enough for them. They want blood. They want him dead. So they go, "All right, we've got a guy who can do this. His name is Pontius Pilate." Okay? He's the Roman governor appointed over Judea. They don't have authority to put him to death. Pontius Pilate does. By Rome's authority, Pontius Pilate can put anybody to death he wants to. Okay? So Pilate's been in power for close to 10 years at this point. His job was pretty easy. He just had to keep Judea calm. He just had to keep the peace. So it's a pretty cushy job for him. Well, the Jewish leaders had every reason to expect a favor from Pontius Pilate because, according to our history books, Pontius Pilate was a cruel, absolutely ruthless man who was completely insensitive to the moral and feelings of others. That's what we know from history. So they thought, surely Pilate will put him to death. He's a troublemaker. We can convince Pilate to put him to death. They were also very, very clever. They knew that Pilate wasn't going to put him to death over religious accusations. Okay? This charge of blasphemy wasn't going to hold up in a Roman court. Okay? This was a religious matter. Rome was not going to have anything to do with a religious matter. So they get together and they make 3 more false accusations against Jesus and bring it to Pilate. That Jesus was a revolutionary, that he incited the people not to pay taxes, which is completely false because what did he say? Give unto Rome what's Rome. Pay your taxes, people. Okay? He's not paying taxes, and he claimed to be a king in opposition of Caesar. It's treason. Okay? So those 3 accusations they bring to Pilate. What was their accusation? Blasphemy and a terrorist threat. Rome goes, we don't care. And they go, okay, well, we'll add on these extra charges to his account, even though they're completely false. Okay? So meanwhile, while all of this is going on, remember we have our 12th disciple. Okay? Matthew tells us what happened to Judas. So Matthew 27, verses 3 and 5. Then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind. That's very important. He changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is this to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went out and he hanged himself. So Judas changes his mind. He's seeing what is happening to Jesus. He's seeing all of this illegal action take place, and he knows what they're going to do. He knows they're going to kill him. So he thinks, if I get back the money, they'll stop this. They don't care. Everything's been put in motion. They know what they're going to do. They don't care about the money. Okay? So he tries to return the money, and they won't have it. They throw it down. He throws it down at their feet. Okay? Judas is filled with remorse at this moment because he's seeing the results of his actions. Okay? He knows exactly what he did, and he's sorry for the results of those actions. But you can see the blatant hypocrisy of the priests. They don't want to touch blood money that they paid. They don't want to touch it because it would make them unclean to touch this blood money. They're the ones who paid it. Okay? They don't want to touch it. So, Judas has no other choice. He is so sorrowful and regretful about what he's done, he goes outside the city and hangs himself on a tree. And we find in Acts what Luke, our doctor, adds. Because according to Matthew, Judas is dead. That's it. That's the end of the story. He went out and hanged himself. That's the end of the story. Luke adds in Acts what happens to the rest of the story. Luke adds that Judas fell headlong into a field and burst open in the middle, and his entrails spilled out all over the field. And even the dogs came and ate it. Okay? So, this is Passover and a Sabbath, and a high Sabbath at that. No one is going outside to take care of a dead body. That would make you unclean. So that body is hanging out there in the sun, and I don't know if you know this about dead bodies, but when they're exposed to those types of conditions, they start to kind of bloat and swell, okay? And at some point, either the rope or the branch breaks from the weight of that body, and he falls, and the impact causes him to burst open, okay? And so it is then named the Field of Blood, because Judas's blood is now contaminated the soil. And the priests go and buy the field with the money that Judas returned to them, because now it's a bloody field, and they know they're not going to be able to do anything with it. Okay? So this is our field of blood, and Judas is out there unrepentant, but sorry. And he has no other choice. Okay? So meanwhile, back inside, Jesus is now taken to Pilate. Okay, we're going to send him over to Pilate. In Luke 23, kind of all over the place, but Luke 23, verses 3 and 4. And Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? This is what they're telling me, you're the king of the Jews. Are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, you have said so. He just agrees. They've all said nothing but true statements. You have said so. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. Okay? So what is Pilate's verdict? Not guilty. Okay? Well, John adds a touch of irony here. The Jews had brought Jesus to Pilate, but they would not ceremonially defile themselves by entering into the Gentile household and court and things like that. Because in doing so, that means they wouldn't be able to take the Passover that night. They wouldn't be able to eat their Passover meal. Okay? So they are rejecting this Messiah, this person who has come to save them, simply to keep a small little tiny ceremonial law. Okay? So you see the irony here. They are willing to keep the ceremonial law, but they're rejecting their Messiah while they're doing it. Okay? So Jesus stands before Pilate, this cruel and ruthless man, and everything that we see from Pilate seems really out of character for him. He seems profoundly affected by being in the presence of Jesus, okay? And he sees this bloody and beaten man. Jesus has kind of been roughed up a little bit by the guards. And he ironically asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews? Because you sure don't look like a king to me." Right? These are your own people who are doing this to you. Are you sure you're their king? And Jesus replies as he has all night, "What you said is right. What you say is true." Okay? And though Pilate is a cruel and ruthless man, he's not stupid. He is absolutely not stupid. He can see through the motives of the religious leaders. He knows something else is going on. They're not telling me something. Okay? He is estimating this whole situation, right? And he can see that there's something else going on. And he says, "I find no guilt in this man. He's not guilty of all the things that he's being accused of." So his verdict is not guilty. Should have been the end of the trial, right? We released him. Everything's great. Jesus gets to come back. Everything's fine. Not guilty. But the religious leaders urge Pilate and emphasize that Jesus is planning an insurrection against Rome. "Pilate, you can't do this. He's going to come back and get an army together and fight Rome." Ironically, Jesus is standing being accused of the one thing he refused to do, be a political savior. That's not what he came to do, and yet that's what he's standing there being accused of. He is not taking a political stand against Rome, but that's what he's being accused of. So, this is something Pilate needed to concern himself with, not the religious aspect of it, but the political aspect of it. Pilate was married to a granddaughter of Caesar Augustus. And if he got on Caesar's bad side, he would be in trouble. Lots of trouble. It would be his neck on the line. He's tasked with keeping peace in Judea. Okay? So he's got to concern himself with this issue. Pilate finds out that Jesus is from Nazareth. Great, that's not Judea, not my jurisdiction. I can send him to Herod. He's a Galilean. Herod's in town for the festival. Great, this is great. I can send him to Herod. Herod can figure out what to do with him because I find him not guilty. He's Herod's problem. So he sends him over to Herod. So Luke 23, stay there in verse 8 and 9, say, "When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, and he had a long desire to see him because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. But as he was questioning him at some length, he had no answer." Okay? So Herod was actually giddy to see Jesus. This is the same Herod that beheaded John the Baptist. And he's been wanting to see Jesus for a long time because he can do miracles. He can do party tricks. Herod loved to be entertained. Okay? He's like, yes, Jesus is here. He's going to turn some water into wine, and it's going to be great, and I'm going to be entertained. Well, Jesus does nothing. He refuses to do any signs. He refuses to do any miracles. He refuses to talk to Herod because he knows what Herod wants. Herod wants to be entertained, and he's not going to give in to that. So, because Jesus is refusing to entertain him, Herod finds his own entertainment. He then allows the soldiers to stand there and mock Jesus and play games with him in front of the crowd of witnesses to entertain himself, to get his entertainment. Okay? And it's interesting that Luke adds that Herod and Pilate were at odds with each other. And over this issue of Jesus, they become BFFs. They become best friends dealing with this issue with Jesus. So it's very interesting, this political layers that are going on. Well, since Jesus refused to say anything to Herod, Herod sends him back to Pilate and says, "He's your problem." Jesus is just getting passed around all night long between the two high priests and these two rulers. He's getting passed from one end of the city to the rest of it all morning long. Okay? So, that's where we're going to leave the story, but we had a question about what happens to Pilate. So let's talk about what happens to Pilate. Previously, we know what happens to Herod. Okay? Remember Herod and his wife, they get exiled, they commit suicide, right? So what happens to Pilate? Well, a few years after the crucifixion in AD 36, a man in Samaria steps forward, claiming to be Moses reincarnated. Okay? I'm Moses, follow me, lead, and listen to me. Okay, but he's in Samaria. So he starts gathering a following. Okay, if you think cults are a new thing, it's not. It's been happening since the dawn of time. He starts gathering a following. I'm Moses, and I know what I'm talking about. So this religious sect of Samaritans start following this false prophet, and they follow him all the way to Mount Gerizim, their holy mountain. Okay? And he claims that Moses, his previous Moses, has hidden the vessels from the temple there. So that's why we know that this is our holy mountain, because Moses hid the things here and not in Jerusalem. Okay? So he goes, if we go there and y'all dig it up, it'll prove who I am, and it'll prove that we are the true Jews. Okay? So he convinces these people to go do this. So this mass of people is heading towards Mount Gerizim to go on a digging expedition to find these vessels, thinking that this guy is truly who he says he is. Well, Pilate intervenes, and he sends soldiers to stop it because it looks like an uprising, right? If they really find the treasures and this guy's really Moses, we're going to have big problems on our hands. We're going to have an uprising. So he sends soldiers to take care of it. Well, the soldiers kill the leaders, including the guy who believes he's Moses, and some others are accidentally killed in the conflict, okay? So according to the historian Josephus, the survivors of that incident go to the governor of Syria, and they accuse Pilate of excessive force and the slaughter of innocents, right? We were just innocent people living about our life, and Pilate sends soldiers to come kill us all, right? So that's what they accuse him of. Well, the governor of Syria sends a friend of his to say, I need you to go to Judea, and I need you to nicely tell Pilate, you need to go to Rome. You need to give up your seat, you need to go to Rome and tell the emperor what your side of the story is, because if these people go to Rome and tell him what you did, it's not going to be great for you, Pilate, okay? So this guy was kind of like a co-worker of Pilate's, all right? He's like giving him some really good advice. You need to go tell your side of the story to the emperor, Tiberius, okay? So Pilate, he's been in his position now for 10 years, which was really unusual, because usually a governor was only about 1 or 2 years, and then they would switch and somebody else would become, because it was just a mess. Nobody wanted to do it, so you would get switched out all the time. Pilate's been in his position for 10 years. He's probably sick and tired of these Jews. So he decides, okay, that's not bad advice. I'm going to leave and I'm going to go to Rome, and I'm going to tell my side of the story. Well, it takes him a while to get there. It's not an easy trip, and he has to do certain things in order to go. By the time he arrives in Rome, Emperor Tiberius is dead. Okay? So now he doesn't have anybody to testify again, to tell his story to. And that is where the historical record ends. We don't have any historical record of what happened. That's all we know. Pilate got on a boat to head to Rome, and as he's going, the emperor dies. We don't know what happens. Okay? We know for sure that he's not reinstated in Judea, okay? But that's kind of to be expected. He's been there for 10 years. They're not going to put him back there. And Emperor Caligula, which is the guy who takes over for Tiberius, would have been the one to hear Pilate's story. If he made it to Rome, he would have been the one to hear his story and to judge, okay? So some traditions say that Pilate was executed by Caligula, or he committed suicide, which was a very popular thing to do in Rome when you're in trouble. You just take your own life. Some traditions, including the Eastern Orthodox Church, claim that Pilate actually became a follower of Jesus. Because of the events that happened in Passover and his wife, who we're going to talk about next week, her influence, he became a follower. And that they faithfully follow the Lord for the rest of their days. That's what the Eastern Orthodox Church believes happened to Pilate. Some simply believe he retired and just lived out his days in Rome until he died. We don't actually know which one's true. We have no record of what happened to Pilate. We don't know if he even made it to Rome or what happened when he got there. But we do know that he had a profound effect on what happened to Jesus. He was completely changed, and the Pilate that we see in the Gospels is not the Pilate of history that we know up until this point. So meeting Jesus and the events of that Passover stayed with Pilate. So it is possible that he did become a follower of Jesus. It is possible that just he got to the end of his career and decided, I'm going to take my life in my own hands, whether that was retirement or suicide, we don't know. We have no record of what